Well, hello, and after a very wet weekend, welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Deborah Evans, LLG Chief Executive, and I'm joined today by Dennis Hall, LLG's Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
Right, so topic of the day. Well, we're starting off having a think about competition in regulation, which came out of the Legal Services Act many years ago, which introduced the idea that within the legal sector, having a number of regulators would be a good idea. So is this working well? Over to you, Dennis, for more on this issue.
Well, Deborah, the regulation of lawyers never used to get into the news very much at all, but in recent weeks it's never been out of the news. First, there's the turf war over Silex members, with two organisations wrestling to control them. And now the Legal Services Board have thrown a spanner in by suggesting that both solicitors and barristers be brought under the same regulatory roof. So what's going on? Here's more. The Chief Executive of the Legal Services Board has claimed there is a strong argument for bringing solicitors and barristers under the same regulator. Matthew Hill was speaking at this week's Law Expo in London in response to a point raised by Mark Neal, Director General of the Bar Standards Board. Hill told the public forum that there is a strong argument in favour of a merger of the BSB and the Solicitors Regulation Authority. Hill did not elaborate, but his remark has alerted lawyers to the possibility of yet more regulatory turbulence. The SRA, which has said that the prospect of a single regulator for lawyers remains a live conversation at Westminster, is already planning to assume oversight of legal executives. A spokesperson for the LSB said Hill's comment was intentionally thought-provoking, as something to consider. But merger is not something that the LSB is actively considering. He added, however, our strategy does state that moving to a single regulator would have public benefits. The Bar is likely to fiercely oppose any such merger. The Bar Council, BSB and SRA all declined to comment. David McNeil, Director of Public Affairs at the Law Society, said, Matthew Hill made a comment about the merits of consolidating the BSB and SRA into a single super regulator, but it was clearly intended to provoke debate and was not a firm proposal. Nonetheless, it was an interesting intervention from the head of the LSB in the debate about the future of legal services regulation, made at a time when the whole question is clouded by the highly problematic proposal from Silex to fragment the regulatory landscape, abolish an existing frontline regulator, and reintroduce a measure of self-regulation into the system. What do our members think of this supposedly thought-provoking comment? Deborah.
Well, that's a good question, really, Dennis, and one for us to find out. The concept of competition in regulation and the fact that you could go, for example, to the SRA to then regulate legal executives obviously came out of a move from a legislation perspective a few years ago. But the question is, does that suit what the profession needs, and does it suit what the public needs? Do they have clarity as to who regulates the particular individual that's dealt with their complaint? So it is one to consider, but if it were to be a move to a super regulator, the most important thing would be that that regulator had the skills and the understanding, in effect, to regulate the different elements of the profession. So more on that undoubtedly to come over the next year or so, I presume. But that's not been the only thing going on at Silex. Obviously, there's been the debate over regulation, but they've also been doing some really proactive work on developing new qualifications. Now, sustainability in local government is a key objective for us in LLG, and we like routes to qualification for new lawyers to be as wide and as varied as possible, to give people the opportunity from all backgrounds, whether they choose to go to university or not, the opportunity to become a lawyer. And this is something that Silex have always been particularly good at. with the on-the-job training to enable people to become lawyers. So what is it that they're looking for now? Well, one of our directors attended the recent Silex Roadshow that's been running, which talked about ideas they have for career grades, etc. And also about work that may be going on in this area to develop new career pathways. And certainly this is something we've also been talking to Silex about for a while now. So there's a few things in the mix here. We're quite keen on the idea of developing qualified paralegals with a firm definition of paralegal, and to be able to qualify into a particular area in local government. Now, obviously, we've already got apprenticeships on the go, and Silex are getting involved in apprenticeships as well. But the idea of qualified paralegals is really very attractive for us, and that would give some of the paralegals we have working out in local government pathways for them to follow in their particular area to become a qualified lawyer. Now, it's also possible for them to do multiple seats as a paralegal or a legal exec and get a more rounded qualification, but this idea specifically of quite a focused qualification is of interest to us. And we've thought particularly about childcare because that's an area where we know it's very difficult to recruit. So to develop paralegals, for example, for childcare, they've got to think about what pathway might be suitable. So we'd be really interested in hearing from members about what elements we think would be needed to change, for example, a childcare paralegal. Now, we're going to be having a think about this over the next few months, and we're going to start with doing an LLG webinar that really explains this new paralegal qualification and how apprenticeships could be used to support that. And then we'd really like to hear from you about what you think you want. Now, this is a great opportunity for all of us to really club together and build something that will be very useful in keeping our legal services department sustainable and producing really good career pathways for us. So that webinar will be coming soon. Watch this space and then please get involved in feeding back to us. So, Dennis, what's next from you?
Well, I'm turning next to the topic of trees. The felling of trees in both Sheffield and Plymouth has caused political storms. And here's the story of how Plymouth, in particular, plan to recover. The more than 100 trees in the centre of Plymouth, whose overnight felling helped bring down the Conservative council, are to be replaced with almost double the number. Council leaders are releasing plans to regenerate Armada Way in the city centre, planting 202 new trees and creating a large children's play area the size of 5 tennis courts. Councillor Deborah Evans, the Labour leader of the City Council, said the trees would not be little spindly things, and that he had chosen older specimens with large girths, so the area would immediately look better with a good canopy. Last March, the then Tory Council authorised the felling of more than 100 trees, which were taken down overnight to the horror of local residents, who woke the next day to find wood strewn across the walkways in the area. The uproar over the destruction of the trees led to the resignation of the Conservative leader of Plymouth Council, who signed off on the decision to chop down the trees as part of a £12 million city centre regeneration scheme. Then, in the local election in May, the party lost control of the council entirely. Now, the Labour-controlled council hopes to salvage the area. The new scheme will include a play village for children made of the wood from the felled trees. There will be water fountains for young people to play in during the summer, as well as play apparatus. The council has consulted biodiversity specialists and chosen 16 species to plant, including silver birch, field maple, Turkish hazel, and Judas trees. Evans said, "The trees will be about 8 meters high and they'll have a big girth around the trunk of up to 35 centimeters. So they're not those little spindly things that you sometimes see being planned. They're going to be ready to go." Indeed, just like our governance conference on the 10th of November at Sheffield, which has a session on the Sheffield inquiry into their tree removal disaster. So look out for that. Deborah.
Yes, indeed, and trees are really stirring emotion in people across the country at the moment, probably as a result of climate change, really increasing the understanding into the importance of trees as the sort of lungs of the nation. And you'll all be aware of the felling of the Robin Hood tree in Sycamore Gap, and just how much backlash that then drove in the local area and indeed nationally. So cutting down a tree in a local authority is no longer just the piece of administration that maybe it had been a few years ago. There's a whole community engagement piece to consider to really get the local area on side and understanding why these works have to take place. Now, there's a lot of lessons learned for people from the Sheffield Tree Inquiry, so we'd encourage you all to come along and have a listen and understand really how this can be done and how it can be managed in the best way possible. And we've got the monitoring officer from Sheffield joining in that discussion. So this is a real to the heart of that debate conversation that we'll be having at the governance conference. So that aside, what else are we thinking of from an LLG perspective? Well, one of the questions that we keep asking ourselves is, has the time come to revisit the historic legislation on which the foundations of local government are currently built and run? You'll be aware, for example, of our campaign for virtual meetings, which comes out of the fact that the 1972 legislation really talks about meeting in person, because at that time the internet wasn't even invented. So this is just one example of where local government is trying to work in an environment that is 50 years old, and it's not the only example. So if you think, for example, of the big real focus on governance that we have at the moment, governance doesn't get a mention in any of the legislation. There's barely anything documented around the role and responsibilities of monitoring officers, and what is there certainly doesn't reflect the job that they do today. So is there an opportunity to revisit this? Now, we don't think that this is a short-term campaign. This has to be a medium to long-term campaign to look at revisiting this legislation and getting it up to date and fit for purpose. But one of the things that's really helpful is to work out where to start. So we're starting from the position of looking at the role of the monitoring officer and how could that be better reflected in legislation, as well as the work we're already doing on virtual meetings. But there's bound to be other areas that you're coming across where the legislation just isn't fit for purpose. So we'll be spending some time really drawing up a list of what needs to change, and then over time we'll get the lobbying into action, where we then campaign for newer and better legislation. And it's not just us. The new leader of the LGA is already calling for the 1972 Act to be revisited, and when I was at the recent conference for SLCC, from the point of view of town councils and parish councils, they're also very keen on looking at this work. So that's just something that we're thinking of developing in the future, because all of these problems actually would be easier to solve if the legislative footing was fit for purpose, up to date and clearer, and gave real weight and power to the role of the monitoring officer. So enough from me. Dennis, back to you.
Thanks, Deborah. Here at LLG, we really do like to include a topic in the grapevine that is both novel and unusual, something perhaps that your own council might want to dig down into. And there's the clue. Listen to this. Hull is set to become the first city in Britain to give people a right to grow on unused council land. Community groups, charities, and even small groups of neighbours would be able to cultivate fruit and vegetables on suitable council land in what campaigners say will provide healthy local food, boost mental health, and revive neglected areas. Hull councillors unanimously passed the Right to Grow motion that means the council will produce a map of suitable land it owns and help those who want to grow food on it overcome practical obstacles such as insurance or provision of water for the plants. The motion which will first go before the Council Scrutiny Committee, follows a burgeoning local and national campaign for a right to grow on neglected urban land. The waiting list for allotments in England has risen by 81% over the past 12 years, as more than 150,000 people seek a place to grow fresh fruit and vegetables. Incredible Edible, Deborah, I simply love that name. Incredible Edible is a grassroots network of more than 150 community growing groups and is calling for a national right to grow law, obliging all local authorities to keep a register of land that could be used for growing and which people could apply to. Campaigners say councils can meet the growing demand for places to grow in urban areas by stripping away bureaucratic obstacles such as growers requiring public liability insurance, which could be provided under councils' existing insurance. Even land earmarked for development that sometimes lies unused for years could be cultivated for 1 or 2 harvests. Well, there's food for thought. What a splendid idea. So do you think this idea might grow on you, Deborah?
Well, as a woman with a greenhouse and 6 raised beds, I think that's a splendid idea, but I would also encourage them to think beyond fruit and vegetables. Very keen on wildflower meadows, for example, on development land that's awaiting development, because that ties in really nicely with some of the climate change objectives and thoughts around biodiversity corridors through our towns and cities, which really enable the sort of fauna and flora within our areas and our communities to develop and grow and flourish, really. So I think that's an absolutely splendid idea. So on that very positive note, you can read more on the items discussed today, and many more indeed, by going to bulletin number 36, available on the LLG website now. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.